Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the National Training Agency webinar series. This is our 14th webinar engaging TVET stakeholders. My name is Balchan Rambaran, Senior Coordinator Enterprises with the National Training Agency, and I have the pleasure of moderating this afternoon's session. Let me take some time to remind our audience that the NTA is the leading body responsible for technical, vocational, education and training in Trinidad and Tobago, as well the home of Trinidad and Tobago's first Univoc Center. In such unprecedented times, the NTA continues its webinar series and remains committed towards the improvement of TVET through close cooperation and collaboration with stakeholders. Our webinar series aims to inform stakeholders about development in the TVET landscape, share information, and support capacity building as it relates to TVET. With that being said, today's webinar topic is on apprenticeship, a pathway to workforce development. This will be presented by Dr. Ramon Iriarte, Education Specialist attached to UNESCO Regional Bureau for Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Iriarte will focus on building a framework for quality apprenticeships, best practices in apprenticeships, a framework for quality apprenticeships, lessons learned from around the world, apprenticeships in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Iriarte has a wealth of experience in management, implementation, monitoring, and reporting on regional programs on TVET, as well as an educator in TVET. We hope that his presentation will motivate you and ignite your passion as it relates to apprenticeship and provides opportunities that will contribute to your personal and professional growth and development, and by extension, national development. With that being said, let us welcome Dr. Iriarte. Sir, let me thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we are really looking forward to hearing your presentation on apprenticeship. So I now invite Dr. Iriarte to do his presentation. Sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Balchan Rambaran. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real pleasure to be here today. I would like to thank you all for joining this webinar, and also a special thanks goes to Mrs. Patrice Paris, CEO at the National Training Agency of Trinidad and Tobago, for the invitation to share our views and recommendations on a topic that has been gaining ground in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is apprenticeships and the way they can contribute to sustainable development in our region. I would like to ask our ICT support to go to the next slide. And I would like to start with the concept, because the first thing we need to think about when we think on apprenticeship is that when we look at the experiences around the world and what different countries are doing in this area, there is no single standardized definition of apprenticeship training used across countries. There are a number of approaches that have been developed over the years, and all these approaches are responding to national needs. But we can see some elements that are common to apprenticeships and are the base for a formal definition of apprenticeships as we understand them. And we understand apprenticeships as a unique form of technical and vocational education and training, combining on-the-job training and off-the-job training, focusing on particular occupations with particular regulations, and also demanding specific sustainable funding. We also understand that apprenticeship requires a social dialogue involving especially governments and the private sectors and workers. We also understand that apprenticeships are regulated by a written contract that details the respective roles and responsibilities of the apprentice and the employer. And usually apprentices also provide remuneration and some social protection coverage, which is also usual for almost all apprenticeships experiences we know around the world. And also apprenticeship have a clearly defined and structured training period, and the successful completion of these apprenticeships obtain a recognized qualification. All these elements are essential elements, and what we understand by apprenticeship should include each and every one of these elements. Next slide, please. The next point is why promoting quality apprenticeships, or what is the interest of countries right now in apprenticeships? And there are several reasons for that. One is that apprenticeships are a good way to facilitate this school to work transition. It can be very difficult for young people to secure a first job. And this is because usually employers are reluctant to hire young people with no experience and without work readiness. And these apprenticeship programs usually enable employers to run a sort of extended recruitment process while they train young people to carry out this specific activities that the company needs. And at the same time, these apprentices have the opportunity to make well-informed choices about training and career option, and also in this process show what kind of potential they have and what kind of contribution they can have for the company. Another point is the coordination between education and work. Apprenticeship programs promote the collaborations between TVET institutions and the labor market. And this is particularly useful when TVET institution design and deliver the curriculum and the training modules. And at the same time, the trainers from TVET institution can better understand the knowledge and skills that are required in the workplace. And this is a very good connection that can be created by apprenticeships. The third element that I would like to mention is that apprenticeships from the company perspective is good business. Apprenticeship programs provide qualified workers. There are many studies that show these kind of approaches increase productivity, lower the cost of recruitment for enterprises, and also in some cases enhance employee retention. Usually the opinion of employers about apprenticeships is positive. And we also have this aspect of providing a cost-effective TVET, because usually we all know that TVET is a very expensive system to sustain for the government. And apprenticeships are a way how governments and enterprises can share the cost, first of anticipating the future skill needs, the cost of equipping TVET institution with the latest facilities and tools, which is usually one of the main weaknesses we see in many countries in the region. Also updating curriculum and training modules, and also upskilling teachers and trainers. These are all elements that require high levels of investment, and apprenticeships can be a way to share costs. Another point is how apprentices can be good for small and medium-sized enterprises. And an important point to mention here is that small and medium-sized enterprises constitute over 95% of companies in the Caribbean sub-region and also in Latin America. And for this reason, we believe that apprenticeships can support small and medium-sized enterprises to deal with the skill shortages and the future development of enterprises, and also to enable young people to acquire the specialized skills they require to provide high-quality services. Next slide, please. This framework was recently proposed by the International Labor Organization as a reference to organize the main building blocks of what we can consider quality apprenticeship, or what are the main elements to consider when we are working to strengthen the quality of our apprenticeship systems. And we see that there are several elements. Among them, for example, we see social dialogue. This is an important element of quality apprenticeships. Apprenticeships require involving social partners, like fundamentally employers and their association and trade unions, who can better identify the training that is needed and the way that it should be provided. Another element is also to have a clear definition of roles and responsibilities of each stakeholder in this system to ensure support and commitment of these different stakeholders. Then we also need to focus on the regulatory framework. This is a component that establishes the overall conditions for designing and implementing system and secures decent work for apprentices. Another aspect we need to consider in developing quality apprenticeships is the funding. We need to establish equitable funding arrangements to ensure willing participation of all stakeholders on a long-term basis that is sustainable. Another element we need to focus on is the labor market relevance to prepare young people for occupations that are actually needed in the labor market. And the last element that is shown here is inclusion, what has to do with inclusiveness. And this is an important element because of the population that is usually targeted with apprenticeship programs. We need to develop the apprenticeship approaches to offer training and work opportunities for all. Next slide, please. I'm going to go into a little more detail on some elements of quality apprenticeships. One is the social dialogue. And we see here that there are several stakeholders involved in the process of developing the concept and the system itself. We have businesses there, we have chambers, professional or sectoral organization, we have the national or regional authorities, we have the TVET institution, and we also have youth and parent organizations. The engagement of social partners is required to ensure that the organization and the content of vocational programs meet the employer's needs, but is also responsible to the needs of the students and the wider society. When we talk about relevance of apprenticeships, we need to think about the relevance related to the labor market needs, but we shouldn't forget also the needs of the students and the needs of the society in general. This social partnership is also crucial for policy development and implementation regarding apprenticeships. And social dialogue can happen at the national level, but also at the sectoral level. And it is strong in many countries. We have seen experiences of social dialogue for apprenticeships in many countries with a long, extensive experience implementing these systems, but it is not the same everywhere. And then it remains a challenge to make sure that the views of employers in a number of countries and of trade unions are heard, and they are all able to contribute to the development of apprenticeship programs. Next slide, please. In terms of the regulatory frameworks required for quality apprenticeships, we can say that quality apprenticeship required these frameworks to establish the overall conditions for the design, for the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of apprenticeship system. Internationally, there is no single dominant model. There is rather a variety of legal regulations and decisions that come from different structure of governance, and it depends on national context. It depends on sometimes on the size of the country, on the political structure of the country, and each country usually decides or develops a system that is appropriate for their own context. And we see here the main functions of the regulatory framework. First is to define apprenticeships. Like I said before, each country has its own definition of apprenticeship, and this definition has to be formalized in terms of a regulatory framework. And the regulatory framework also needs to specify the status of apprentice. In some countries, apprentices are considered employees. In other countries, are not considered employees, are trainees. And that makes a difference in terms of what kind of benefits they can have in the process of going through an apprenticeship program. We also need to define the governance, to set out the institutional mechanisms for governing and managing apprenticeships, and how social dialogue will play a role in this process of governing the system. We need to specify and clarify the rights, the roles, and responsibilities of stakeholders. We need to specify what are the traits and the qualifications that are covered under apprenticeships. We need to specify, usually the regulatory frameworks specify the duration of the apprenticeship, some details on the proportion of on-the-job and off-the-job training involved, how is the process for assessment and certification. These regulatory frameworks also outline mechanisms to ensure quality and relevance of the apprenticeships. They also inform and promote social inclusion and gender equality. This is a point I'm going to talk about later too. And also the last point, specifying what are the monitoring and evaluation arrangements that are going to be implemented for the apprenticeships. Next slide, please. In terms of the regulatory frameworks, there are different levels that we can find them to operate. The first level are usually laws that are enacted at the national or at the regional level and are enforced by means of acts, decrees, and regulation. And the second level includes decisions made by sectoral bodies. And the third level is made up mostly of the contractual arrangement between the employer and the apprentices or their representative. At the national level, in usually thinking about these broader laws and regulations, we can find two different types of legislation. Some of them are specific laws on apprenticeships. Some countries like Belgium, like New Zealand, like the United States, they all have a specific law on apprenticeship, and others have a broader law that refer to labor rights, but also containing regulation on apprenticeships. Germany is a country like that, and Switzerland and Italy and some other countries in Europe and around the world. And also it's important to mention that the regulation of apprenticeship training is often influenced by other laws which relate to other parts of the education and training system, for example, regarding funding, regarding quality assurance, regarding administrative structures, etc. Next slide, please. In terms of the roles, the involvement of stakeholders help to promote a common understanding and a sort of collective spirits that holds the apprenticeship system together. And this collaboration between stakeholders make apprenticeship systems successful. So the role played by stakeholders and the collaboration among them is very crucial. Some of the stakeholders usually involved are shown here. We see, for example, the apprentices themselves. They need to inform themselves before entering into a quality apprenticeship. They need to understand better what it involves, what alternatives they have, what is required in terms of activities and commitment. And this stage of information and getting information and providing information is important to avoid what we see commonly in terms of non-completion or early termination of apprenticeship programs. So the efforts we make in developing this information system and having this interested student or people in general involved in this kind of information process and counseling process is one of the key aspects. Employers are another part of this structure of stakeholders, and they must comply with specific standards of training provision. In some countries, the employers may be unable to provide opportunities for training in line with the outcomes, with the expected outcomes. But sometimes they join together, especially in small countries. Happens a lot with small and medium enterprises. They are not able to provide all opportunities for training, all aspects that a student might need, and they are grouped together in what I call group training organizations. This is a model that has worked in several countries, especially Australia is a good example of that. And these companies that are part of the group training organization, each one is responsible for a part of the training and developing the skills that are needed for a particular occupation. Another element in this group of stakeholders are workers, and especially workers' representatives. These are responsible for representing the interests of apprenticeships in the running of quality apprenticeship systems at the enterprise level. And they are usually responsible to ensure appropriate working and training conditions for apprentices that might help to prevent exploitative practices under the guise of training. And they also can provide apprentices with advice for training activities. And there are good examples of that. For example, in the United Kingdom, these kind of workers' representatives, they are called union learning representatives. They help to identify and deliver training opportunities. They raise awareness on the value of lifelong learning. They support apprentices through their learning program. And sometimes they can also represent them or negotiate on their behalf on learning issues. We also have an important group of stakeholders in the trainers. These are the in-company trainers, or they are also called sometimes mentors or supervisors. And they're the ones that are directly responsible for interacting with apprentices. They impart practical training. They introduce them into the work during the on-the-job part of the training. They also act, or at least should act, as a focal point for the apprenticeship program. And they also coordinate with other sections and workers in the enterprise. We have also TVET institutions as an important stakeholder in this process of visualizing quality apprenticeship. And these TVET institutions should contribute to the design and development and implementation of the institution-based learning components of the apprenticeship program. They also support the partner enterprises in establishing the training plan. And they also build the capacity of teachers and trainers responsible for the delivery and assessment of apprentices. Another group of relevant stakeholders are the TVET teachers and trainers. These are the ones that plan, organize, and deliver off-the-job training in TVET institution within the framework of the overall apprenticeship program. And they also interact with their counterparts in partner enterprises in order to ensure optimal coordination between the off-the-job and on-the-job elements of the apprenticeship programs. Teachers have a challenging task. They need to not only have the knowledge, but they also need the work experience in partner enterprises in order to have an understanding of the skills, the requirements of the different occupations, and also to experience personally the learning environment of apprentices in enterprises. Sometimes these teachers are required, just like students, to have some practical training in companies. Some countries have developed this system of internships for teachers in order to give them an opportunity to update their knowledge and skills regarding the different occupations and the activities that the enterprise is carrying out. Then we have a group of stakeholders that are called support services, and these support services can be provided to, for example, employ apprenticeships, to manage the training, to support their needs. Some countries have these structures formally established. This can be, for example, in Germany, we have the Chambers of Commerce and Industry, or the Chambers of Crafts and Professional Association. And these are very good to do these different kinds of aspects that are required in apprenticeships. And also in Australia, this role is played by the group training organization. They are responsible for selecting apprentices to undertake the employer responsibilities, like, for example, wages, or provide allowances, or manage the quality of the training. We also have the trade unions in this process, participating in policy making regarding apprenticeship. And we have the government, the ministries, and the public agencies responsible for vocational education and training. These are the stakeholders that formulate and adopt a national strategy to promote apprenticeship in collaboration with employers association, with trade unions, and other stakeholders. So this group of stakeholders, as I mentioned, they have their unique roles, their responsibilities, and the key to quality apprentices is to be able to promote this articulation and collaboration among these very different stakeholders with very different perspectives of what they need from apprenticeships and how apprenticeships should be conducted. And that is the great challenge usually in articulating a quality apprenticeship system. Next slide, please. Talking about funding, we need to recognize that the implementation of apprenticeship involves costs and benefits. Costs and benefits for employers, for apprentices, and for governments. And we need to cover these costs. And there are basically two different funding sources we have identified and are usually in place. We have the enterprises, the employers that bear the cost of on-the-job training, wages and allowances, and social security contribution. And we also have the governments, and they finance off-the-job training in TVET institution. They also finance the administration of the scheme and incentives for employers where they exist. We can see here the different aspects of funding. It is important to notice that usually in the early stages of an apprenticeship program, there is an important investment to be made by enterprises, because the initial expenditure of training in terms of wages, of allowance, of social security contribution, in terms of time for in-company mentors, in terms of training material, is high for companies. And however, when apprentices learn skills and become more productive, the costs and benefits start to even out, and employers can recover the initial investment in training. And even there are several studies showing that some employers have positive returns within the apprenticeship period, while others see their investment pay off after accounting for the reduced turnover, recruitment, and initial training costs. In well-functioning apprenticeship system, usually enterprises recover their investment over time in terms of better skills fit and through the partial productive activation of learners during training. The most important benefits of apprenticeships for apprentices are better employment opportunities and career prospects. And this is thanks to the relevant knowledge, skills, and competencies acquired. In financial terms, apprentices receive some wages and allowances even during training, while young people who join TVET institution and our university may pay fees in some cases. Also, it is good to mention that apprenticeships lead to lower unemployment and higher earnings for young workers. So a government can save on social security and an active labor market policy related expenditures and gain more tax revenue. So there are good policy reasons for government to encourage and support employers financially. In some countries, governments even provide incentives to enterprises to encourage them to take on apprentices. And this can be either in the form of tax exemptions, subsidies, sometimes are grants linked to levy schemes. And these incentives contribute to a reduction of on-the-job training and social protection costs. And is a way also to encourage employers to comply with countries' labor regulation. And apprentices get incentives to cover learning materials, allowances for learning away from home, food, transportation, and sometimes also additional support when they come from vulnerable groups, women or disabled persons. Next slide, please. When we plan a funding arrangement for apprenticeship, there are some important things to consider. First, we need to estimate the costs and benefits, and we need to consider financial and non-financial costs and benefits of apprenticeship training for enterprises, for apprentices, and for the government. We also need to strengthen government's capacity to finance off-the-job training and employers' participation, and that means usually providing incentives. Third, we need to secure the enterprise's commitment, financing on-the-job training, and supporting off-the-job training. And finally, we need to make sure that the funding arrangement that we have selected is sufficient to sustain apprenticeship training. So the funding should be sustainable. Next slide, please. And to remain relevant, an apprenticeship program must align, like we said before, to labor market needs, to individual needs, and societal needs. And this can be done through at least 4 different approaches that are conducted before and after the implementation of the apprenticeship program. The first approach is providing guidance, counseling, and support service. Guidance should be provided during and after the apprenticeship. Everyone should be informed about career choices and employment prospects to choose what apprenticeship and career they may take up based on their skills and aptitude and what is required by the various occupations. Guidance and mentoring during apprenticeships at the workplace and school also help to improve completion rates. Supervisors and trainers in enterprises also require guidance and support services to be fully competent themselves in guiding and supervising the practical training of apprentices at the workplace. In terms of counseling service, they are provided usually through public employment services, and in some countries, they provide information and support to help young people find an apprenticeship place, as well as post-employment counseling to help people find employment. And these services provided by the public employment services may also include training to develop core competencies like interview skills, preparation of resumes, and job application, which are also very demanded skills for young people when they're going to apply for a job. And also support services develop the capacity of institutions and persons providing apprentices. And these support can include guidelines, for example, or manuals and training programs for various stakeholders. For example, capacity building of company trainers, mentors, TVET school teachers, producing learning materials for apprentices, assessment tools for assessor, and good practice case studies. A second element in this group of factors to consider in terms of relevance, we see evaluation of apprenticeship programs, and the evaluation is needed and is required to provide information about the relevance of the apprenticeship programs to the different needs. And this is a way in which policymakers and program developers can improve the system and programs. And there are several methods to carry out this evaluation, like, for example, tracer studies of graduate, some feedback from employers. There are some cost-benefit analysis that can be done. And usually tracer studies and feedback from employers provide the information about the quality and relevance of the training. And the evaluation also involves skills assessment and certification. And this is done to assess if apprentices have acquired the set of learning outcomes of a qualification. There are a number of countries that at the moment are aligning their apprenticeship qualification with their national qualification framework. So this is also a process that is growing. And in some countries, there are separate assessment centers in place to test the competences of apprentices. The third element here, in terms of relevance of apprenticeship programs, is the skills needs assessment and anticipation. This is also an important process, and these are activities to assess what are the future skill needs in a strategic way. And the purpose of this assessment is to provide information about current and future skills needs, so that decision makers can develop measures and take actions with a view to meeting the needs and avoiding the imbalances. And finally, the quality assurance for apprenticeship, that this should occur at all levels, at the system levels, at all training places and processes, and at the assessment and certification level. And the quality assurance should involve usually standard setting. It can involve monitoring and implementation of apprentices, assessing and certifying competencies, evaluating the labor market relevance of training, and support service. Next slide, please. In terms of skills needs assessment and anticipation, we can say that this is a process divided into a number of key elements. We see here, for example, the skills needs assessment involves institution, involves collecting of data, involve the analytical capacity to process the data, and also involves methods and tools. A number of organizations are usually involved in this process of skills needs anticipation. For example, We have ministries of labor and education. We have national TVET agencies. We have sectoral skills bodies, statistical offices, and each of these institutions brings some advantage, brings some resources, and complement the role of the others. We usually need to have a lead institution to ensure the cooperation and coordination between all other institutions. The information on skills needs that is produced is used by the majority of the countries in developing policy, in updating the occupational standards, in developing apprenticeship programs, in revising and designing training programs, and the upskilling of trainers. Also, it is important to notice that translating the skills needs that are result of this process of assessment into training and certification requires a process with several steps, and also requires the involvement of many stakeholders. So the definition of this process and the stakeholders' role is defined in the local legislation usually. Next slide, please. I would like to provide some recommendation to improve the relevance of apprenticeships. We see this, one of the main elements we need to consider is to assess training practices. What are the training practices in place, and what results are we getting with these training practices? Another important recommendation is to carry out labor market analysis. This is also a process that is usually in place in many countries through the ministries of labor. There are specialized teams that are in charge of this process. Another recommendation is to build sectoral committees. This can be tripartite or it can be bipartite. There are several ways of organizing, and many countries have different approaches. But we usually see most commonly tripartite committees in terms of sectoral committees. We also recommend carrying out skills needs analysis. Like I mentioned before, this skills analysis has its process and has a particular purpose to anticipate the skills that will be needed for the future. Another important component in terms of relevance is the training of teachers and trainers, the development of relevant curricula, the design of relevant curricula, and finally, preparing an appropriate financing scheme. Next slide, please. In terms of gender equality, this is also an important aspect of quality apprenticeship, to consider gender equality. And this is because we know from experience that around the world, women are generally underrepresented in apprenticeship programs. We have 46.5% of women in Jamaica, 43% in Denmark, for example. We have 33% of women enrolled in apprenticeship programs in France, 20% in Belgium, and only 1% in Ireland. And the reason for this usually has to do with the fact that men and women train in very different sectors. And this is producing what we call occupational segregation in the workforce. Women are significantly underrepresented in high quality sectors, such as engineering, when men are underrepresented in low pay sectors, such as childcare. And another problem is usually that apprenticeship programs are more likely to be available in traditional trades and crafts regarded as male occupation, such as building or bricklaying or mechanic or welding. And this is also a problem, and this is one of the reasons why women are perhaps not very much involved in apprenticeships in many countries. The international experience has identified some reasons why women are less likely to participate in apprenticeship programs. And these are reasons that we need to think about in order to develop appropriate measures to address this problem. One of the problems we see here, and we see in this graphic as impediments to gender equality, is the culture and traditional gender roles. Young women choosing traditionally male-dominated occupation usually face a strong resistance in the labor market, while when we see young men choosing traditionally female occupation, they can also be exposed to ridicule sometimes. And this is part of the cultural and traditional gender roles problem that we need to address. Another problem is gender stereotyping. And gender stereotypes can lead to discrimination by employers and also career counselors, and also can lead to self-limitation by young women themselves. And this happens in countries with relatively high gender equality. There is still a clear gender bias in terms of the occupational choices of young women and men. Another problem is the lack of career guidance that also has an impact in gender equality. In many countries, career guidance services are not well developed or are not available, and young people often make choices with very limited information about their options, about their possibilities, and how they can grow in the process of these apprenticeship programs. Another point that is mentioned here is also safety concerns, especially in terms of sexual harassment and gender-based violence. This can take the form of bullying, physical aggression by fellow apprentices, co-workers, teachers, trainers, employers. There are several risks in the process of implementing equitable apprenticeship programs. There are also some family responsibilities involved. Some apprentices also have families that they are responsible for. So this is also particularly important in the case of women. And the last point has to do with available apprenticeship. We mentioned before that some apprenticeship programs are just not available for women, because usually apprentices are available in traditional trades and crafts in some countries, and other kinds of occupations are not implemented following this approach that we call apprenticeship. Next slide, please. We have some measures that we can follow to improve gender equality in apprenticeship. For example, this is what has been done in England. They have set targets to increase the participation of women in targeted sectors. They have had campaigns to raise awareness among young women regarding opportunities in targeted sectors. They have organized open days, promotional events, job shadowing opportunities. They have also worked in advertising, how to have an appropriate language, to adapt the language of advertising in the description of jobs and apprenticeships, to make sure that they attract especially female candidates. Another measure that can be useful too is the greater availability of part-time and flexible apprenticeship that cater to women particularly. And also the provision of information, advice, and guidance to women for particular training programs or for particular apprenticeships, in order to challenge these gender stereotypes. Next slide, please. Another group of people that I would like to refer to is also related to inclusion of persons with disabilities. And in terms of persons with disabilities, we can say that they also face many barriers to entering work, usually prejudice, they lack of work experience, they are isolated from society sometimes, they have low schooling levels. So in order to address these problems and how to develop an apprenticeship system that can be inclusive of persons with disabilities, we can have apprenticeship programs that are organized in order to help demonstrate the work potential and the contributions of persons with disabilities. And this group of persons with disabilities can also accumulate work experience. They can develop, they can have development of practical social skills. They can also have the opportunity for compensatory schooling in terms of foundation skills, because these skills are acquired more easily if they are used at work. Usually in apprenticeship programs, there is the possibility to adapt learning to individual needs and the learning pace. And we also have the possibility through apprenticeship to avoid exploitation, providing social benefits, providing remuneration, and providing the possibility to affiliate to a union that can protect the rights of fellow workers that are persons with disabilities. Next slide. Talking about the experience of implementation of apprenticeships in Latin America and the Caribbean, we can say that most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are still far from the advanced experiences of apprenticeships that we see in other regions of the world. And especially because the experiences we have in our region don't have the basic characteristics of apprenticeship programs and the structure of an apprenticeship system that make apprenticeship delivery more sustainable and more effective. We see in this table how different countries integrate the different elements that are basic in apprenticeship programs. We see Brazil, for example, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Peru. And each of these countries have different ways of implementing apprenticeship. We see, for example, in the case of Chile, they have, for example, they include a contract, an agreement between the employer and the apprentice, which is one of the main features or the main characteristics of apprentices. We have a defined training plan, and we have the on-the-job and off-the-job training component, but we don't have the last basic element, which is the assessment and the industry recognized certification of the qualification. And we have another example in Mexico, for example, and in Mexico, it's another idea of apprenticeship because the apprenticeships are implemented within the formal education system at the secondary school level. So we see here that there is no contract or agreement between the employer and apprentice because apprenticeship is not considered a job. And for that reason, usually they also companies won't pay wages for that. And we see other countries too. We see in Chile, for example, there are also some differences in terms of on-the-job and off-the-job training. We have on-the-job training in Chile, but there's usually no off-the-job training in the training institution. And also there is no assessment and industry recognized certification after completing the qualification. So there are many differences in the ways different countries in the region understand apprenticeships and how they implement. And also this is because of the regulatory framework that defines apprenticeship in different ways. Next slide, please. I'd like to mention, from our perspective, what the main challenges are to implement apprenticeships in Latin America and the Caribbean. One of the reasons has to do with economic problems. There is still a low economic performance of the region. There are high levels of informality, and there is a high incidence of small and medium enterprises. And as I mentioned before, small and medium enterprises have limited capacity to provide apprenticeships in terms of developing all the skills that are required in a particular qualification. So when we have a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises, we need a particular scheme and a particular way to organize these enterprises to work together to implement apprenticeship properly. Another challenge is educational. We have still skills deficiencies. We have basic skills deficiencies, and this makes it difficult sometimes to develop apprenticeships at the level that we usually see apprenticeships established around the world. Apprentices are usually implemented to develop high-level skills that require basic skills, a language or math or science skills, and sometimes the educational system are not developing these required skills. There are also legal limitations. Sometimes the regulations on apprenticeships are outdated or don't really reflect the context or the needs of the country. This usually happens when the legal framework has been somehow developed looking at what other countries have done, but not reflecting on what the local context and the reality is. So we have these problems with the legal framework and the labor regulations that affect the cost of hiring workers. We have a problem in terms of information. We have seen this in many countries, the lack of adequate labor market intelligence and information on the labor market dynamics. And there is not much information in some countries regarding impact evaluation, cost-benefit analysis, and prospective analysis of how the labor market is going to evolve. And all these information are important to develop an appropriate apprenticeship system. And there is an institutional challenge too, in terms of lacking a strong quality assurance mechanism, the certification framework, and also how to formalize the institutional framework that is required to implement apprenticeship programs and apprenticeship systems. And the last point that is included here is the social and cultural problem also. This problem of lack of collaboration and trust between public and private sector is also an important problem in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it's difficult to address. We have seen over the last decades several attempts to bring together the public and the private sectors, and somehow it's still difficult to find an appropriate communication and connection, and to have them work together in the process of developing appropriate and good apprenticeship systems. Next slide, please. Some lessons that we have learned from the implementation of apprenticeships in Latin America and the Caribbean. I will mention this very quickly. In Latin America, more than half of the national apprenticeship programs target both in-school and out-of-school population. So we think it's important to consider not just out-of-school population, but also in-school, because apprenticeship programs can have good opportunities for learning for both of these groups. And another lesson that we can mention is that apprenticeship programs in some countries are focused on particular age groups. Like, for example, in Colombia, in Costa Rica, in Mexico, there are no limitation of age, but if we look at Brazil and Chile and Peru, they have upper age limits for apprentices. So this has to do with the national policy and which groups are focused in the apprenticeship system, and what are the needs of each country. Then another point is regarding the duration of the training. In some countries, we find no mandatory minimum duration, but sometimes specifying a minimum duration could be important, because it has to do with cost and benefits. When the apprenticeship is too short, there are several studies that suggest that the relationship between cost and benefits is not very convenient. So there is a point when the implementation of this approach of apprenticeship start to be interesting in terms of cost-benefit relations. So something to think about is what would be the minimum duration of apprenticeship that makes it convenient in terms of investment and return. Another point is the existence of formal wages. I already mentioned that we have some countries in the region that don't consider apprenticeship as work. So employers do not pay a wage to the apprentice, and the student is not an employee. And in other countries, the concept is different. So this is something also to think about. Some countries have already made their decisions regarding that. And finally, we talk about the incentives. What kind of incentives we can give, what kind of incentives for apprentices to cover the cost of participation in the program, and also incentives for the companies, for the enterprises, including, for example, tax breaks, training and wage subsidies, and other that can help to promote quality apprenticeships in the country. Next slide, please. I think that was the... Okay, we have the final considerations for this presentation based on everything that was presented and the different ideas and concepts and challenges of apprentices. We think that it is very important to develop a good understanding of the challenges that apprenticeship programs are trying to solve. The first step is what we want apprenticeship programs to solve, and anticipate the problems that can be arrived at when implementing these programs. So this is the first starting point. What do we want from apprenticeships? The next point is considering these key elements that are part of the definition of apprenticeships. Like, for example, there must be a contract or an agreement between the employer and the apprentices. There must be a structured training plan. There must be a combination of on-the-job, off-the-job training, and there must be an assessment and industry-recognized certification. If we agree on this definition, then we can start developing an apprenticeship system that has a better quality and is clear in terms of definition. The next point is regarding the type of training that we should target when we are implementing apprenticeships. We believe that apprenticeships should be targeted only at at that kind of training that require sustained and substantial training, not the initial training or the basic training, because of the cost that is involved in the implementation of the apprenticeship. And also because of the possibility to involve employers and the government in this process. We also want to highlight the need of the basic skills. We hope that all apprentices would have reached basic levels of English and math and science before they can enter and complete the apprenticeship program. We'd also like to highlight the importance of industry standards as the basis of every apprenticeship, and linking to professional registration in sectors where this exists. We need to ensure government funding, especially to provide incentives for apprenticeship training. And finally, collaboration. This is a crucial point. We need collaboration among stakeholders. We need to identify who should be involved in the process of developing and implementing apprenticeships, and also who should lead the process, and how we can motivate these different stakeholders to get committed to developing a quality apprenticeship. I think that is all that I wanted to share with you. I thank you very much for listening, and I'm open to any question or comment regarding this presentation.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Iriarte, for your time, for a very panoramic view on apprenticeship. I know your presentation would have been well received by a lot of our viewers. So again, thank you for that contribution. And at this point, we would want to entertain questions from our online audience for you. We will try our best to address as many questions as time would allow us. So we'll get right into the questions. And just to start off the questioning, Dr. Ramon, when you talk about funding and the importance of funding to apprenticeship training, we recognize in your presentation that the government as well as the enterprise would provide some funding. But in terms of having a sustainable mode of funding, can you share with us from your experience, what are some of the strategies countries can employ to provide a more sustainable mode of funding?
Yes. Well, in terms of funding, there are several examples, countries with good examples. We have, for example, apprenticeships in England, where the government funded the off-the-job training, the employer which funded the wages, and usually this scheme of the government funding the off-the-job training and the companies funding the on-the-job training is the most common, and what we have found as most successful. We can see the same kind of approach required in many countries. We also see, for example, in Austria, we see, for example, in Canada, in Australia. So I think this is very much dependent on how the country is organized, and also who can support with funding. But in general, what we see from the experience in different countries around the world are these two components. One from the government coming for the off-the-job training, and one from the companies for the on-the-job training.
Okay, thank you for that response, Dr. Ramon. The other question has to do with legislation. And your presentation again articulated that in a lot of the countries, more so Latin America and the Caribbean, you find that legislation is an issue with regard to setting up apprenticeships. Some countries may have legislation which are outdated or that are not relevant for today's perspective. In light And we know that legislation takes time to be put in place. In light of that, what can countries do to advance their approach with apprenticeship while the legislation is taking time to be developed and so on?
Yes, that is usually the challenge with legislation. It takes sometimes to get it issued and to work on it. I think the important process is to promote this collaboration and this commitment, because we see a lot happening that sometimes we have very good legislation, but even having this good legislation, things don't seem to work because the commitment sometimes is not there. So I think besides working on a good legislation, it's also crucial to work on the commitment that each one of the stakeholders we mentioned can have in this process, because that's the way we can overcome this complexity of the time that it takes to get a good legislation. I think commitment is the key to address this problem.
Okay, thank you again for that. Another question coming from the audience is, when we look at on the job initiatives, on the job training initiatives, you have many initiatives in the workplace, and you have different types of on the job programs. Are they all considered apprenticeships, or apprenticeships is distinctly different from other forms of on the job training?
Yes, and that's what I said before. Definition is the key, and the way this word apprenticeship is defined in different countries is different. So there is no single concept internationally in different countries. We have some recommendations, we have some agreements, we have some works done by UNESCO, by ILO, recommending to adopt this single concept of apprenticeship involving these four basic elements that I mentioned before. But the problem is that each country has to decide which is the best definition of apprentices that they can adopt. I think it's evolving, and I think most of the countries that are now considering apprenticeships agree that apprenticeships should have at least these four elements. The consideration that it is a job, there is a contract, there is an agreement between the employer and the apprentice, there is a defined training plan, there is an on-the-job and off-the-job training, and finally there is an assessment, and there is an industry recognized certification. But sometimes the legal framework still does not reflect that. So I think it's going to we are going to still need to work on that and to support different countries on having this common vision of apprenticeships in order to get there. I mean, to get these quality apprentices we are looking for.
All right, thank you again. In light of looking at apprenticeships, a lot of people have the view that apprenticeships are only for young people. In your experience, is apprenticeship afforded to adults and other categories of people?
Yes, in my opinion, apprenticeships are a good approach for young and adults. But perhaps the issue is that each country has to define specific priorities. And what we see is that usually young people are mostly affected by these problems of underemployment or unemployment, are the target of national policies addressing this issue. Young people are the potential workforce of a country. And that's why, in my opinion, perhaps that's the reason why apprenticeships have been more focused on young people. But I think if we think about this lifelong learning perspective. We need to understand that we are going to need to change that perspective probably, and because people are going to need to be retrained. Some jobs are going to, like we see right now in the context of the pandemic, some jobs are disappearing, and new ones are being created, and we're going to need some very flexible approaches. Apprenticeship is a good way to do it, and I think we're going to need to think how to address the how to use, how to take advantage of this apprenticeship approach to develop skills in adult population.
And Dr. Ramon, one final question before we close. Do you see apprenticeship being at different levels?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
I'm asking, do you see apprenticeship programs being pegged at different levels? Because I heard you talk about aligning the qualifications of the apprenticeship with the qualification framework. And I'm asking now, so is there in your experience, have you seen apprenticeship at different levels based on the qualification framework?
Yes, we have some experiences or some efforts trying to combine the strengthening of the apprenticeship system with the qualification frameworks. The thing is that qualifications framework themselves are still evolving in the region, especially if we talk about the region. Qualification frameworks are still is a movement they're still starting, so they are still organizing this structure, and apprenticeships have a longer history, but I think it will, and I think it will be necessary to think about how to include these qualifications in terms of apprenticeship with the efforts that are being made right now in terms of the development and strengthening of the national qualification frameworks. They are both need to be combined to make it more efficient.
All right, thank you. And that brings us to the end of our few question and answer sessions with you, Dr. Ramon. So from all of us at the NTA, we say thank you again for your presentation and for your time and support. So that concludes our presentation for this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We wish to thank our audience for their continued support of the NTA's webinar. And please be reminded that you can view our presentation and our previous webinars on our NTA YouTube channel. So with that in mind, Dr. Ramon, again, thank you so much. Stay safe and God bless to all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.